All right, we will go ahead and get started. So, like I said, this is the last uh, session for this particular semester, but starting spring, we do have a full schedule for spring as well. So today we are going to focus on data governance and why it is important when we talk about AI. Altaz is from Infotech Research Group. He's a senior advisory director for the group, and I have been working with him on this particular topic for a while as well now. So Altaz, if you want to introduce yourself and get going,
Sure,
that would be
sure,
great.
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. It's a pleasure. It's an honor to be here to meet all of you today. I'm an AI advisor, as was mentioned, and my goal here today is to help educate, to help inform, so that you're aware of some of the things that we are seeing. The company that I work for, the organization, Infotech Research Group, primarily what we do is we focus on practices around AI and a lot of the IT types of initiatives that are out there. And what we try to do is we try to figure out ways that people are working through problems that they have, whether it happens to be around AI or data or governance or security and so on. So for today's conversation, we're really going to keep it focused around the data and the AI side. But in the future, if you're at all interested, please feel free, let us know. We're happy to come in and talk about other topics as well. What I'm going to do is let me start by just sharing my screen. Please let me know if you're able to see my full screen. It should be the title slide.
We can, Altaz.
Great, thank you. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk really about the context of AI and data. Then we're going to talk a little bit about building blocks and capabilities. What do we need as part of the engine to go in there and help us with AI? And then culminate in some next steps. My intent with the presentation is to keep it to around 25, 30 minutes. And that will open up plenty of time for us to go in and to have some additional questions as well. And we can take it from there. First, let's take a look at the context. We are seeing that there's all kinds of changes happening on the data space right now. First of all, we have a lot more of it than we used to. The other thing is, in terms of the data that we have, historically, we largely used structured data, whether it was in databases, whether it was in data warehouses, whether it was inside Excel spreadsheets, and so on. But now we've expanded and we're starting to look at both unstructured and semi-structured data as well. And so to try to make sense of this data, we've now moved ahead and we're using AI to help us make sense of all of this information. As we've spoken to several educational institutions, we've spoken to organizations around the globe, and these tend to be the value drivers. In other words, what is it that an educational institution typically focuses on in terms of the value that it creates? So we've got at the beginning things like growth. We're focused on operational excellence. So we want to do the best job we can internally. There's research, a focus on risk and resilience, making sure we're able to focus on our brand, the impact of the community, and so on. Now, the reason I bring this slide up is whenever we talk about AI and the benefits that AI can bring, at the end of the day, whatever we decide to do with AI has to map to some kind of value creation. And these are typically the things that we see. So oftentimes when someone comes in and suggests a given AI use case, one of the first questions is, how is this going to help us as an institution? And so we start the conversation from here. The challenge that we have these days is, first of all, the speed at which data is coming at us. We've got streaming data, we've got data that's coming in from log files, we've got so many different areas where the data is coming in really fast. Secondly, we also have the idea now that the information that we've got is no longer contained inside a single system. So it's coming from IoT devices, it's coming from the end user, it's coming from many, many different places. And what this is now doing is it's now adding pressure to our technology teams, to our leaders in the data space, to think about the data pipelines, to think about how we're going to take all of this vast amount of information, do something with it, and then ultimately make it available to as wide a group as possible. And in many cases, the same data that we have is being made available to entirely different groups of people. So we might have researchers, we might have administrators, we might have people from many, many different areas, instructors and so on. When we look at where the challenges lie in trying to help the institutions, to help the business folks achieve what they're looking for, first of all, we find that there's a lot of time taken to go in and assess the data management. So here we're talking about the quality of the information, the consistency of the information, and so on. The other is to look at it from a business perspective to help the business understand that if we're going to roll out AI, there are some things that we need to do related to AI, but they may not be as visible. For example, data governance or data literacy. These are really important things to think about because later on, when we start to use AI, we need to think about things like privacy. We need to take a look and see what it means from the perspective of who's got access to it, who owns it, who's the steward of the data, how do we engineer the data appropriately? Do we need to migrate it to another store somewhere else or some type of technology so it can be made available to AI? So there's some architectural discussions that need to happen and so on. So fundamentally, the bottom line is that for AI to work effectively, we need to have some kind of data and analytics capability. Now, as we think about rolling out these analytics capabilities, I will show you later on where we have a few slides describing what are some of these kinds of capabilities that we typically see. So we've got, for example, when we look at the student flow or when we take a look at the researcher's flow, there are things in those streams, in those processes where there are places for AI to make a difference. But fundamentally, we need a team that can go in and pull the data when needed to assist us in the processes that we're currently embarked in. This slide here just expresses what are the myriad of use cases that are out there. So for example, we'll have something for students where there's an admissions chatbot. These days, students want a simple process that they can use. They want to be able to upload things, view things on their devices, for example. That's just one example. Another example is for recruiting. So we'll go in and we'll have marketing combined with AI to go in and try to attract the best students to our institution. Or we might have adaptive learning where there's an opportunity to use AI to complement what we're doing internally. And so now it accelerates that learning process for students as well as from a pedagogical standpoint. So it's from the instructor's perspective as well. So again, many, many use cases. This by no means is a complete set of use cases. It's just a small sample of what's possible. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is we're trying to elevate our thinking up the hierarchy of this data, information, knowledge, and wisdom triangle. Historically, we've played a lot in the data space, which is the foundation. When we look at the data, what we used to have historically would be a human being coming in and making sense of the data that we've got. And so we derive essentially information from the data that we have. Now, in the realm of AI, what we are doing is we are accelerating this process. So we are now accumulating knowledge much faster because we're taking the data, and from the data, AI can now go in extract various concepts, and then associate these concepts together. Where it becomes important for the human being now is to look at the knowledge and the wisdom, because AI on its own is just a technology. It may create associations with concepts that could conform to reality, or they may not. So, from a data and analytics and AI perspective, we have to make sure that we now start to think in terms of critical thinking skills, in terms of bias of the information, in terms of making sure that what we produce is accurate, it's not harming individuals, and so on. So notice how we've elevated the role of data now to a much higher level. This is the way that we're generally progressing at this point. Why is that important? Because if we take a look at the typical flow of data, the user will come in, the user will essentially have some interaction with an AI tool or an engine of some kind, and they will get a response. But under the hood, there's all kinds of bias that exists inside the AI workflow. We have sample bias from our data or from a data that a vendor might provide. We might have some kind of programmatic morality bias that exists. This is right, this is wrong, and so on. There may be bias around Overton windows and deference to just say, hey, we're going to let this go. Since this came, for example, from a large vendor, we therefore assume that they've been through all the checks and balances. So we are implicitly going to trust the output. So you'll notice that throughout all of this, while AI is impressive, it's by no means perfect. So these biases carry on all the way through. And so going back to the previous slide that I was showing, the goal is to go in and to make sure we understand our data and we understand how to think critically so that we can go back to the AI engine and perhaps ask a different question, prompt it differently, and so on. So at the end of the day, the elephant in the room here is the data. You can only go and achieve the level of satisfaction and value creation based on how well your data is conformant to standards that you have, how often it's updated, and so on. So there's a full engagement now that needs to happen on managing our data appropriately. When we look at this in context, what are we trying to do? So on the left-hand side is where we have our data. On the right-hand side is where we've got all the different groups that we would eventually like to use the data. So we might have researchers and administrators and so on. So these are all the different personas that we've got. In the middle is where we've got some transformation. We've got things coming in from just the ability to extract and look at features and so on. Now, not every use case is going to require us to have a degree of transparency internally with what's happening in AI. But over time, it helps to understand how we can take the left-hand side where we consist of structured, semi-structured, and unstructured data, ingest it into some kind of a service, be able to extract meaningful insights, knowledge, information, and so on, think critically about this, and then make this now available to end users. So this applies whether we're thinking about machine learning, whether we're thinking about generative AI, whether we're thinking about agents, and so on. The workflow largely remains the same. And there are many vendors that will give you bits and pieces, as I will show you momentarily, bits and pieces of all of these different areas. So working through something like this is not done overnight. It's methodical, it's intentional, it's a calculated approach that you use. And generally, the way we see this rolling out is by going in bite-sized chunks. So you construct a prototype, then you move to a pilot, and then you scale it gradually out. So this is an example of the kind of building blocks. If we go right into the AI engine and the workflows, this is the type of thing that we typically see. So we've got, for example, our data sources, which include which format, includes the velocity, includes the various variations of the kinds of data we've got. And we decide, how are we, first of all, going to ingest this into our pipeline? Is it going to be extraction and transformation? Are we just going to load it from one system to another? Are we going to go in and are we going to essentially request it? Is it going to be built into the system and so on? And then we end up here really with the whole data science side. So we've got to go through this iterative process of experimentation, looking at the different models, seeing how these models can help us. Now, we might use models that have already been pre-trained, or we might decide to train our own. Microsoft Copilot Studio, for example, allows you very easily to go in there and to create your own agent. So this is what we're starting to see, but we need to make sure that this is governed appropriately. Underneath all of this, we cannot forget about data governance and data security. All of these things become important to make sure that we're rolling out AI responsibly. When we talk now about data governance, and I just ended the last slide talking about how we need to be responsible, there are different roles and responsibilities when it comes to AI. Not everyone can do everything in the data space. We need to have folks that are champions. These are people who are using certain data on a day-to-day basis, and they have a really good understanding of what that data means. Then we've got our owners, the ones that are ultimately accountable for protecting the data, making sure the data is accurate, and so on. Then we've got stewards. Typically, IT is a steward. We handle the data, we manage it, we take it from point A to point B, and so on. So in the case, let's say we want to use Copilot, how are we going to make it available? Are we going to put it in SharePoint? Is it going to be in Teams? Who's going to oversee all of these things? So looking at data governance, it's really a team effort where everybody has a role to play from a governance standpoint. It's not just an IT thing. Value gets created by looking at it from a business perspective, and IT facilitates these kinds of implementations and discussions. The goal at the end of the day is to make sure that we understand clearly why AI was put in place. Why does this practice exist? What was the purpose? So there has to be a mission helping us understand what we're planning to do in the short term, and a vision which allows us to go in the future to say, this is where we see things going, and we have a role to play in that world where, for example, every tool might have AI capabilities. We've got mobile devices that will have their own agents, and so on. At the end of the day, when we look at data and we look at AI, it should be driven by the business, as I was mentioning. The goal is not to have a technical discussion and start from what is possible technically and then look for a business problem. It goes the other way around. What's the flow of what we're doing on the business side? How do we bring that now into the realm of AI? And what are some of the things that AI can help us with? Maybe it is a chatbot. Maybe it's something to do with machine learning. Maybe it's something to do with marketing and finance and things like that, going in and helping students out and so on. But at the end of the day, the goal is the value should be created by looking at it from the perspective of the business. And when we get to the business, the goal is to generate value. And when we look at that value, ultimately what this is going to map to is, are we creating the value in a way that helps us manage the risk? So typically when we look at educational institutions, risk typically emerges when we talk about things like our reputation, or we talk about community involvement and things like that. So what we're trying to do is to make sure that in the course of delivering this value, we do not, through the use of AI, inadvertently start to impact our reputation. And how do we now affect the value streams as we go through this? This is what I'm going to talk about next. Here's an example of the student life cycle. So if we look at it, we've got essentially large blocks of what would typically be involved as part of the student life cycle. So we'll start as an example with recruitment, then they get admitted, then they get enrolled, then they need all kinds of support services, they're going to take some courses, and at the end, they're going to go in and they're going to advance. So in this broad stream that we're talking about here, underneath all of this, there are all kinds of things that are going on. Here's an example. So just on the recruitment side, it's taking a look and examining, for example, prospective students, or looking at grad students, looking at the undergrads, maybe who are international, trying to look at all the various things that we can do. And so the intent now is, where in here are we currently finding that it's really difficult and repetitive and it's error prone and so on? Can we start to bring in AI to facilitate and to help us with this? Maybe it's part of the admissions around application processing or the intake process. Now, keep in mind, the intent is not to suggest that AI replaces the human. That doesn't happen because of that DIKW triangle that I was showing you. At the end of the day, it's the human being that thinks critically about the output. And so we're focused here on these things to use AI to help us and assist us in achieving some of these particular capabilities. So once again, when we look at this, out of this will emerge all kinds of use cases that we can use. But going back to what I said earlier, not everything should get AI, because sometimes when we look at it, the value isn't there. Is this going to help us in some way? Is it going to make us more productive? Is it going to help us manage our cost? Is it going to help us manage our risk? And so on. So again, lots and lots of areas where we can use AI. There's another stream. This is on the instruction and on the research side. So generally we'll go in, we'll do some teaching and learning and some research, eventually leading perhaps to even commercialization where we have some intellectual property and so on. Now, underneath this broad stream that we have, once again, we've got a lot of different areas. Notice how we could go in and we can use, for example, from a teaching and learning perspective, we can use AI to assist us with design of the curriculum, to try and assess the quality, to try and come up with examples, to try and even use AI in the classroom, for example. So many different areas that AI can assist us with. And then on the business side, where we've got shared services, for example, even on the administrative side, going in and looking at things like scheduling, policy creation, policy enhancement, and so on. So what I would like to leave you with is there's a broad range of activities that happen inside an academic institution. Some are related to students, some are related to administrators, some are related to researchers and faculty and so on. In all of the work that we're doing, where can we intentionally deploy AI so that it will unlock the value that we're looking for? Maybe the value that we're looking for is productivity. Maybe it has to do with being innovative so that we can go and we can start to create, for example, courses and have automated ways of assessing and being able to go and summarize some of the content that we have and so on. When we look at data, there are, just as we saw capabilities for each of the streams, like the student and the faculty and so on, we also have now capabilities that we need to bring when it comes to data and AI. For example, we have to think about data quality. We have to think about data integration. We have to think about what are the products that are out there. How can we go and how can we use AI to help us optimize our cost, which is part of realizing value, and so on. Now, again, when we look at all of these areas where potentially AI can assist us through the use of data, this is going to take a group to come together to think about what data is, first of all, available, because AI is based on data. So what information and what data is available that would allow us to now embark on the previous slides where we want to start to look at unlocking value against those capabilities. But if, for example, our data quality is not there, then there are certain use cases that are off limits for now, or certainly we can bring them down a little bit and scale them down as needed. So therefore, when we start to move forward from a data and AI perspective, do it intelligently, do it intentionally, and make sure it's not a problem of trying to stretch too far. We've seen that where some organizations have gone too far. They've got a product in place, for example, and now they're not sure what kind of value they're going to derive from it. So it's a lesson learned. And so we share that information. Let's learn from each other. And this is part of the capabilities that you're going to need from a data perspective. So what are some next steps? And I'll just close with this. Ultimately, we need to build capabilities to support value creation, which essentially means business needs. As we do all of this, we have to be clear on roles and responsibilities, which is where governance comes in. To govern something means to be clear about who does what, how do we interact with each other, and so on. And then plan to build for an AI future. Do it incrementally, step by step, starting with prototypes, and then moving on to pilots, and then eventually scaling out. And at this point, let's open it up. Let's have a discussion. Let's talk about some stuff. So, Madhavi, I'll hand it over to you if you want to add some additional insights and context, and then I guess we can open it up after that.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Altaz. Very, very useful. So just so everybody knows, at UND, we have already started our IT governance structure, right? That went into place at the beginning of this year. Our next up is the data governance, and I see quite a few of the data governance committee members in this group, including Matt Brasik, who is the chief data officer, who is my partner in crime for the data governance effort. Then, of course, our AI governance. These are all, I look at these things as a jigsaw puzzle that needs to fit in perfectly for us to get to the future that we want to get to. So, and we will share more information on the data governance as we put the teams together and have a roadmap on how we are going to implement thoughtfully across the campus. Again, just like Altaz said, this is not a one-time thing that we won't be able to give a particular day and then say, yep, data governance is done. It's a journey. It's a never-ending journey that we have to build on as we go along. So anybody from the data governance committees, do you guys want to kind of talk about a little bit of what we have done so far so we can get back to the conversation on how this is going to help our AI efforts? I know you are there. I can see your names.
I can pop in on this a little bit. So, yeah, I mean, we really have kind of gotten this data governance process kind of up and running, and we've, identified what those key pieces are, not only in terms of what steps we need to be taking, but I kind of exactly what you were just saying, identifying and clarifying those roles, ensuring that we have our data owners identified, our custodians, our stewards, and making sure that those people are aware of those roles, I would say would probably be one of our biggest pieces. So,
Yeah, Altaz, do you mind talking about what you have seen or heard of anyone who has done, like jumped ahead without having the foundational work done first?
Oh
The
yeah.
risks of
So
doing
yeah,
that.
yeah. So the governance aspect of this is really important. When teams start to go ahead and it's not clear what needs to happen, then there's oftentimes a duplication of technologies. We start to see costs beginning to go up. There's no clear indication of how risk is going to be managed. We don't know where the data is going to come from, how it's going to be protected. So there have been situations where data has leaked. People don't know that the information is necessarily leaking. They're using it to summarize, for example, PhD level documentation and so on, which is leaking out into the public space, for example. And this represents intellectual property for an institution. So we see these kinds of things happening. The one thing I also want to say is when we talk about governance, it doesn't imply that we have to go in and create something entirely new. So AI governance, very often, if there is, let's say, a data governance team already in place, there's no reason that we cannot consider, even initially, of taking data governance and starting to add AI governance elements inside their meetings and things like that. The goal is to keep the structure as consistent as possible and try to avoid creating new teams, new structures, because then you have to go through the whole process of creating a charter. You have to go in there and start to bring people in, set aside time for doing that. Now that's another meeting that you need to attend, which might be very similar to our previous meeting that we just had. And we start to get into these kinds of run-ins beginning to happen. So generally speaking, when a team has planned out the governance appropriately, and I just went and did something with a large institution where they had like an enterprise IT team, so a centralized IT team, and then they had various campuses, and they had leads on the campus. And part of the governance was to go in there and try to determine what's the handshaking going to look like between the campus and this organizational wide IT team that exists. For example, if it has to do with procurement or it has to do with certain data, what does that look like? Do we share that responsibility? Does one team do something versus another? If there's a use case that comes in, what's the intake process going to look like, and so on. And we literally took just 3 swim lanes. We had the use case owners, we had enterprise IT, and we ended up having campus IT. And so now, just within the 3 swim lanes, we started to talk about what that handshaking would look like. And as you start to go now the next level below that, so this is what Matt was talking about, you then have to have clarity on who is responsible for the creation of data, maintaining the quality of the data, making sure the data remains secure, and so on. And this gets a little bit tricky because if it's a federated model and you've got, for example, researchers collecting information and data and so on, then rather than trying to go in and stifle innovation, we now have to think about the right way of maybe creating an infrastructure where researchers can do their work that they need while still remaining protected. And so we start to see these kinds of conversations unfold. But trying to do AI without having governance just begins to unravel a whole bunch of things. And then trying to bring it together becomes very tedious. And it's a lot of work to try and get everybody to agree at that point. So better to do it up front rather than trying to go in there and fix it later on.
Any questions? I'm watching to see any hands coming up, or if you want to turn your video on and ask questions. Yes, Dr. Mahalingam, go ahead.
Yes, I have a question for Altaz. In the environment of agentic AI, what is your experience in creating reconfigurable data architectures where, depending on the role of the agentic AI, it can provide access, levels of security, clearance, and all of those variables on the fly, where the agent that comes to the data storage place suddenly has a particular configuration of the data that's appropriate for the agent.
Yeah.
What is the technology evolving in that realm?
Yeah. So first of all, let me start by looking at this from a business lens, and then I'll drive down to the technology lens. From a business perspective, the way that we have traditionally managed risk, and in this case, AI risk, has been to first identify what are the potential risks, come up with the correct mitigations, and then from the mitigations, we set up a set of controls and policies, and then it's done, and we move forward. In agentic AI, and AI more broadly, I would say, the risk paradigm has shifted, and we are now essentially moving towards an adaptive risk management where there are things that are emerging that we didn't do before or didn't know before, but we're now having to manage those risks. So, from the business side, from the risk side, it's all about assessing the risks as they come in and very quickly being able to go and remediate those risks and move forward with that. Now let's bring it down to the technology level. What are the implications of an adaptive risk management style when it comes to agentic and the ability to go in there and on the fly adapt from a security and privacy standpoint against the data stores that we've got? What will emerge from this now is, from the risk lens, we need to see, first of all, when we examine the model where the agents are now making decisions, because that's what agents are supposed to do. They're supposed to make certain decisions. If we relinquish the human control and allow the agents to go in there and make decisions around security and privacy, from a technology standpoint, it's doable. But what does it mean from a business standpoint, from an organizational standpoint? Could this type of behavior that agents are exhibiting impact us reputationally? Could it impact us from an intellectual property perspective and so on? So we have to bubble this up ultimately to a risk lens and look at what now we can do in this context. Not to say yes or no, because if it turns out that we want to move forward with this area, let's say from a research perspective or from deploying something inside a process, let's say, then if it turns out that this is acceptable, then we'll go ahead and we'll do it. Now, architecturally, we then need to think about this. Where are the agents going to be trained, first of all, before they make these decisions? And is the data that we've got going to be coming in on a regular basis? What's the velocity of the data that we have? How do we intake this, train the models, deploy this in a manner that stays consistent, so we don't start to have the agents behaving correctly this month, but then next month they start behaving anomalously, and we start to have these kinds of deviations occurring. So there's got to be that continuous reinforcement to go and make sure that these agents are behaving appropriately, and these become part of the guardrails that emerge when we think about it from a business risk standpoint, and we start to bring it down. So these are some of the things that we're thinking about now. So when we go forward, this is where we start to see multi-agent architectures coming in. You start to see one agent going in there, and you've got like a diversity of training models from various agents going in there and working together to try and see what might be the best mediated approach that we want to use, and so on. So this is the kind of thing that we're seeing right now. I would say I have seen, for example, where something like this, we had on the service desk side, there are organizations that are trying to reduce the cost from a service desk standpoint, and they've deployed agents to go in and precisely be able to go and walk a user through and, in fact, change their password on their account, because that's one of the top things that always comes up. How do I change my password? So on the one hand, we can send automated reminders, but on the other hand, we can use agents to go in and do this. Now, some organizations will look at that in their risk profile and say, this is a non-starter. We're not doing that. We will not allow agents to go in there and manage our security. On the other hand, we've got other organizations saying the risk for us is manageable and we accept it, and therefore we will allow an agent to go in and start to use this mechanism by which they can go in and change password. But that agent had to have been trained somewhere along the line. What is it that's acceptable and what is not, and so on. This is where we touch on what we were speaking about earlier on the data governance side. So from that perspective, we need to make sure that the data that we've got is governed appropriately and the information is being made available to the agent so that it does not tend to hallucinate as we start to embark on these kind of operational activities. It was a very brief, and I just basically ran right through it. But there are architectural issues that need to come into play, privacy issues, security issues, technology issues. All of these need to come together. And what I've seen organizations that are starting to embark on these things, rather than creating bespoke agentic architectures and frameworks, generally the consensus is to go in there and create some kind of a platform that we can go in and use. And it's in that platform that we can govern it appropriately to make sure we're not deviating and starting to introduce risk. I hope that helps.
Yeah, I just have a follow-up question.
Yeah.
When you do adaptive risk management,
Yeah.
Can you train your agents on synthetic data to make sure that they behave in an appropriate way for adaptive risk management?
Yeah, in some cases, that is the only way to do it. Because if you try to do anything in the real world, it would either be catastrophic or it might be something that is just too expensive to do. So yes, we do see there are certain situations where synthetic data can be helpful. If it's only trained on synthetic data, then that does represent a risk. you need to think about whether that risk is manageable or not, because synthetic data is essentially data that has been created by AI. Was there any bias in the creation of that synthetic data? And if we think that it's manageable, then we go forward with it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yep, no problem.
Any other questions? So Altaz, let me touch on something that you said earlier that, yeah, so there's IT governance, data governance, AI governance. Those are at least the things that we are thinking over here, right? So at the beginning, for a university who have never had that before, what we have done now so far is to have that IT governance, and then data governance is very close to socialize with the university, and AI governance is coming right behind that, right? So the people in these groups, they are overlapping. So where, and Matt and I were chatting in the background here. So my dream would be to eventually have that one big happy family, that because those are, like I said, they are very connected, right? So have you seen that happening? I feel like we have to mature a little bit more on the things that we are doing to get to that point. But I think I heard you saying that that would be the ideal solution.
Yeah. What I see when I explore and I have conversations with many different institutions and organizations, for example, AI governance oftentimes fits under the IT umbrella. So IT has an IT governance, and then AI governance somehow fits into it. So we already start to see AI governance and data governance and these things start to fit into a broader umbrella. Now, for organizations that are just starting out, what I usually see, even from a risk standpoint, they'll have like an AI risk and a data risk and an IT risk, and they'll have it separate because it's easy to just track it. But eventually, all of this does come together. And now the question is, structurally, what do we need to do? Because if we start to bring in all of these governance mechanisms together, it means the teams, the processes, all of this needs to come together as well. So we might have, for example, some on the enterprise side, we might have some members on the campus side, for example. How do we begin to bring these teams together? And the governance and establishing the right protocols of exchange becomes important. So as you start to bring it together, it's natural to do that because you start to see the benefits of doing that. It can help you from a cost, from an efficiency standpoint, and all of those things. No question about that. But making sure that everybody understands the implications of that. So, for example, if we need to move and we have to create, for example, an agentic architecture or some new novel algorithm that we're developing, as an example, what does the IT governance, data governance, AI governance, what is the role of this team or teams as we start to converge and bring this together in allowing us to move very quickly to do something like that? So those are the types of discussions that are starting to happen. So initially, yes, you can keep them separate. It just allows teams to move a little bit quicker. Usually there's an oversight just to make sure that these teams are not all kind of doing their own governance, but eventually these things will start to come together. And just to be very clear, AI governance specifically, if you could take any governance, but let me talk about AI governance here. If AI governance operates by itself in a little corner somewhere, very quickly it's going to lose its value because then it's not really listening and responding to the needs that are beginning to come up. There will be policies created, but the policies will make no sense, for example, right? So it has to attach to something. And oftentimes we'll see data governance, AI governance, IT governance, they will touch other teams like procurement or risk management or legal teams, for example. How are we going to respond to the concerns that these other teams have? So that integration needs to be there as we continue to evolve. And essentially, what we are discussing when we talk about the convergence of these teams is we are changing the way that we operate. And now the discussion turns to what is our operating model essentially going to look like? Is it one team? Is it 3 teams? Is it a hybrid structure that we're going to have? and we discuss the pros and cons and gradually begin to evolve that.
Yeah, any other questions? All right, I got one more for you then, Altaz. So we talked about the agents and how people are creating some of these, right? So I have heard from multiple universities arguments on whether we want to do this in-house, right? Build everything in-house, or do we want to partner with somebody like OpenAI, Microsoft? What are your thoughts on that, and what have you seen?
Yeah. So when organizations are just starting out, generally what I see is, because they don't have the capabilities or the governance to do this, generally speaking, they will reach out to vendors and they will form some kind of a partnership. And these partners, these vendors, will help them to build these capabilities internally. Now, over time, there will emerge certain use cases that don't fit into the mold of what these vendors can do for us. So in that case, we now are faced with a situation where we have to build something on our own. And this now comes to the governance side. First of all, do we have the data that we need? Is the data going to be made available for us to go in and conduct the necessary data science or agentic development and to create the models that we need and so on? And as we start to build these kinds of capabilities, we find that it becomes multidisciplinary. So we need capabilities not just on the AI core, for example, the data science, the machine learning, the infrastructure, and so on. But we need to expand beyond that now to start to think about things like, what does it mean from a security perspective? What does it mean from a legal perspective, and so on? So those capabilities need to come in. And usually this cross-functional group that we spoke about earlier that eventually converges, that group is the one that goes in and determines what are the guardrails to facilitate the move from something that might be largely partnership driven to something that is going to be bespoke and something that we're going to create internally for ourselves. So that's one approach that we've seen. Another approach is driven by the sensitivity of the data. So once again, we come back to the data. So I've spoken to some organizations and they will not allow any external AI, whether commercial or open source or anything, but they cannot allow anything outside of their network to have any kind of access to their information because it's highly classified and it's very sensitive. The only option in that case is to go in and build something internally, in which case you can start with some simple models and eventually evolve into something that starts to get to the agentic side. But usually we find that those organizations have historically some kind of capability around AI and they understand what the risks are. So those are some of the things to consider. On the one hand, think about your capabilities. On the other hand, think about the data itself from a governance standpoint, how sensitive it is, which means that you have to have some kind of classification scheme or something to determine what's going to be usable and not, and then you drive it from there.
Questions? All right, I'll throw one more at you, Altaz. Can you go back to, if you don't mind, can you go back a few slides to that capability mapping that you had?
Yep, not a problem. Would you like to go to
go to the other one, yeah.
This one, the data one, or the student one?
No,
Okay,
you had operational side value stream, the student cycle one, yes. So this is something that we should be thinking about at the beginning.
Yeah.
right?
When you think about your AI initiatives, so one of the biggest gaps that I see as I've spoken to other organizations is there isn't a clear indication of why they're going to be implementing a specific AI initiative. But if you think about this up front, now your use case becomes really clear. If it has to do, for example, with going in there and attracting and engaging with a grad student, for example, what is it specifically that we would like to use AI for in that? And so it begins to unlock the discussion where we could say, well, grad students are really busy. Sometimes they need to go in there, they've got to summarize information, or they need help with grading stuff for like the undergrads. They need assistance and so on and so forth, maybe scheduling, things like that. So there are some cases that emerge, and then we probe still further, and we go in and we begin to unpack it to say, okay, let's focus first of all on the value that we're thinking about here. And the value goes back to what's the value to the organization at the end of the day. Is this going to help improve our brand? Is it going to help us to manage our risk? Is it going to help us to go and attract students? Whatever that is. Is it going to make us more efficient? And then we go from there. And then we start to talk about the feasibility of being able to do this. Is it feasible? Can we manage the risk? What's the cost going to be on an ongoing basis, and so on? And if the value and the feasibility balance out, then based on these capabilities and the use cases that emerge from that discussion, now we can start to go forward. And we can start to put these use cases and start to roll it out. But again, not rolling out at scale. It just gives us the ability to go and roll it out as a prototype. Let's experiment with this first. Let's iterate. Did it work? Did it not work? Did it help? And then from there, if it works, then we move to a pilot. Add more people, maybe bring some vendors in, have a discussion, and then we gradually roll it out into production at that point. But the capability assessment is a key part of initially looking at things.
Rick, I think I saw your hand coming up first.
Yeah, so this was a very informative screen for me. It kind of changed the way I think about some of the work that we're doing. So Madhavi, I've already been making I've been making some notes on our document about thinking about some of the things that are in this capability map. But one of the things, this isn't exactly a question so much as an observation. One of the things that I think isn't here because it appears in other capability maps, but is the idea of AI as an accelerant for individualized learning, self-directed learning, remediation, identification of students who are struggling early on through patterns, but also just getting AI in the hands of students and teachers, because there's things that we can teach them to do now that will make huge differences in their practice. But yet we're at a beginning stage of maturity with all of this. So we don't have all of our governance worked out. We don't have all of our policies worked out. And yet I think there's an ethical case to be made for saying we can't afford to wait until we've solved those things and we are mature before we put some of these tools in people's hands. So we're, that whatever metaphor, chicken egg, building the plane as you fly it, we have to do some things now even before we're ready. And I think that leads to some issues, some concerns that we have about access and equity and cost, because one argument would be, look, there's some things we can do and we can teach people to do, but they're going to have an identified secure AI, private AI that we will support and work with. But do we provide that for all of our students and all of our faculty right off the bat so that everybody has an even playing field? The cost is enormous when we start doing that. So it's a tricky balancing act. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, if others are struggling with that issue.
Yeah, I have seen that exactly. Now we're seeing the evolution from what used to be a discussion around using AI responsibly to now using AI ethically. And so now this starts to get into, could this be, could it go in there and exclude certain individuals from having access to AI? Could it potentially be used to go in there? And could there be harm created out of something like this? Like, all these things begin to emerge now. And so we've seen all the way up at a global level. For example, UNESCO has created, the European Commission is starting to create now some things around ethical use of AI and so on. So when I look at institutions that have been using AI, cost is always a consideration. And so that discussion is difficult. Usually what we see is the enterprise IT team takes it upon themselves to go in and create the infrastructure so that we could go in and start to use that. Now, it does mean that there's a trade-off. We can't get everything for everybody. What we can do is we can start with the foundation. Now, if you need more, usually at the starting, at the initial stages, it's on a case-by-case basis. But there is a foundation, like an enclave could get created. That enclave allows us to go in and use just the OpenAI stuff inside a private instance, and we're going to use that. Now, you want to go in there and create an agent on top of that, let's talk, because that's a separate discussion we need to bring in OpenAI with to say, we might be interested, but what can you do to work with us to help out, and so on and so forth. So it's usually that kind of a discussion. But yeah, I've had discussions with some people where some people want to use AI, but they really don't need AI. And so there's a hard discussion to come back and say, actually, you don't need an agent for this. You can just use Copilot in a browser, or you can use ChatGPT. It's fine. We've even had conversations with people to say, you don't even need an enclave. The stuff you do is open. I mean, everybody knows about this stuff. And so you can use that. So you've got all these variations inside the toolbox. You pick and choose the one that makes sense. And if there happens to be a consensus decision that we need to at least create a baseline so that we're protecting our information, that becomes the baseline, and then you gradually grow it from there. But it's all done in a very fiscally prudent way.
All right, Dr. Ganapathy, I think we have one last question.
Yeah, I hope this can be a concluding question. When you do a capability map, let's say for the different value streams that you talk about, should this discussion not be an integral part of it? Which capabilities you assign to AI and which you assign to other ways of doing with human participants and human interaction? Because not everything in the capability map, for instance, that you have for the student lifecycle is appropriate to be done by AI. So there's this tendency that we create these capability maps and we assume that every single one of them has to be addressed by AI. And it may not be the case. It just needs another layer of evaluation and say, we do only a few of these things using AI. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well said. Absolutely. We have a hammer. Everything now looks like a nail. So I've had discussions with people where they want to go and they want to use generative AI to go in there and make decisions, and they want it to be with 100% accuracy, no residual error. And it's like, that's not going to work. It's a probabilistic model. It's based on heuristics. If you want high degree of accuracy and consistency, go with something else like RPA, or use a script file or something like that, which you know will execute the same way every single time. We do not, in this slide, intend for this to be what are the candidate opportunities. This is just a capability map. And so there must be some kind of diligence exercise to go in and to assess from these capabilities, underneath the capabilities, what processes can actually help us through the use of AI. And usually what we see is when organizations are first starting out, they will focus on personal productivity. What can I do better, faster, and so on? And then as they mature, they move on to the next level. From a capability standpoint, they now look at how can we integrate some of these things together? Because now we're looking at processes that maybe start with the grad student enrollment and move on to something else and tie on to something else and so on. Can we create something like that? And then we move on from there to what we were talking about earlier. It's rethinking the operating model and what role does AI have to play organizationally for us now as well. So yes, you have to be look at this prudently. Don't jump and start to put AI all over the place. Step by step, based on where you are. And to the point that was made earlier, you may not have all of this thought out right away. So governance is not intended to slow things down. Governance is intended to say, we're here to enable this, but let's make sure we understand what the risks are, what controls we can put in place, what mitigations, what policies, and so on. That's it. We go in, we do something, we have an assessment that takes place, and we move. None of this implies that we're going to address all of the risk. It doesn't happen. Same thing happens with security and privacy in any other area. Somehow, because we've got AI, people sometimes lock it down in a way that we wouldn't normally do anyway. So let me give you a quick example. I know we're coming to the end here. A quick example. We had people come in and they were concerned with, for example, the fact that we're going to be using AI and we're concerned about privacy. Great, good question. But if we step outside of AI, the process itself never focused on privacy. So why now, when we look at AI, are we focused on privacy? We need to step back, look at the entire process outside of AI, strengthen privacy in there, and then reasonably go in and say, now we need to bring this into AI. Because if we do it in AI, it doesn't matter. It's going to leak out anyway in the broader process. So these are the kinds of discussions that begin to happen now.
Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you, Altaz. Wonderful discussions. And I am going to post the link in the chat for spring schedule. Again, thank you to everybody who showed up on this snowy day. It's still snowing out there with even the school closures. Thank you, Altaz. Very, very useful information, especially as we move ahead with the structures that we need to put into place to make sure that our environments are safe and that we got what we need. Thank you again, everybody. Happy holidays. We will see you in January.